Well, welcome everybody to today's Level Up Consulting Partners webinar, Stellar Design for Privacy, making a great first impression with new users. My name is Dave Cohen. I am a senior manager here at Level Up Consulting Partners, and I'll be your host for today's program. And we're going to get started in just a minute. So looking forward to getting started with the conversation. But before we do, I wanted to just share with everybody a few kind of program details. There's a fantastic presentation, a visual presentation that we've got prepared for you here, a set of slides. For those of you wondering about getting a copy of those slides, we are going to send a follow-up email following this webinar, this live event, that will include a link to view the recording of the webinar, and also will include a PDF of the slides. So if you're wondering about the slides, you can get a copy through that method. We're also going to provide contact information at the end of the program, so you can reach out to me directly if you'd like anything else there. Also want to let you know that we are very much hoping that this is an interactive experience. For those of you out in the audience, if you came with prepared questions, that's terrific. And we encourage you to submit them at any time through the functions in Zoom, the question and answer panel or the chat. I'm going to be monitoring that throughout, so we will be looking there for any questions that you may have. And I think with that, let me talk to you about the structure for today's program. In just a minute, I'm going to introduce today's panelists, and then we're going to we've broken the presentation down into a few sections for you. We're going to talk about kind of some of the fundamentals of design, like Design 101. And then we're going to talk specifically about dark patterns, what they are, how to avoid them. And then we're going to look at some, those of you on the call that have some experience working with cookie consent design. We're going to look at some do's and don'ts there and some ways to enhance that. And then we're going to talk about how to design for privacy compliance. So for those of you here looking to create positive interactions with your users through your privacy compliance efforts, we're going to talk about some very specific ways to do that. And then, as I mentioned, for whatever time we have left at the end, we're going to tackle your questions. So please go ahead and submit those through the written chat and Q&A functions. And so with that, let me move on and introduce today's expert panelists. And I'd like to start today with Dr. Jennifer King. Jen is an information scientist by training and a recognized expert and scholar in information privacy. Jen's research examines the public's understanding and expectations of online privacy, as well as the policy implications of emerging technologies. She's been featured in numerous publications and outlets, including New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, Wired, Recode, NPR, all the major media outlets that you've heard of, and many others. We're very happy to have Jen on the program with us today. So welcome, Jen.
Good morning from California. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah. We'll also make note of the fact that we may have a few cameos from Jen's kids this morning, so be on the lookout for younger ones. And then joining Jen on the panel today, Caroline Sinders is award-winning critical designer, researcher, and artist. She's worked with the Tate Exchange, the Tate Modern in London, the UN, Ars Electronica's AI Lab, Harvard Kennedy School, among other distinguished institutions. And for the past few years, Caroline has been examining the intersections of AI, intersectional justice, system design, harm in politics and digital conversational spaces and technology platforms. Some really interesting work, Caroline, and thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
And then to round out our panel today, last but certainly not least, our own Luke Lubensky is a senior associate with us here at Level Up Consulting Partners. Luke comes from a background in cybersecurity, privacy, risk governance, and compliance, where he's managed and performed risk assessments and compliance projects for clients. Luke has experience in network penetration testing, scripting, and managing databases and servers, and has more recently expanded his skill sets into privacy design as he bridges the highly technical, low-level IT elements and overarching privacy, risk, and compliance frameworks and implementation. Luke, thanks for taking some time away from your project work today to join us on the panel.
Absolutely. Glad to be here. Thanks, Dave.
All right. And with that, and without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started with the conversation. So I'm going to turn it over to Caroline to get us started with looking at the basics of design.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm excited to be walking you through just some basic things around good design and really understanding the benefits of design in terms of engaging with it for your own company or software, etc. Next slide, please. So design is so many things. Design can influence how you structure an entire project, the way that project flows, and then the actual look and feel of a product along with its functionality. Design will incorporate things like user research, product research, competitive research, strategic analysis, foresight planning, and then the actual technical building of your project. So it's not just sort of visual arts, it is all of these things. Design, again, is this sort of fluency and a skill. Design really does a lot. Next slide, please. I want to unpack a few key principles in design, like understanding design patterns and design principles. So a design principle isn't a motto or a description of your team or your company or your product. It's really, it is really a value statement that directly ties to that product and your software. It shouldn't say, for example, we are a data-driven experience, but it should say something about why your product exists, how it uses technology, and how that helps your users and what your aims are. Some design principles situate empathy and advocate for the users, but I think design principles should also include why your product exists and how that relates to your values. For example, if you are a B2B company making a suite of tools for email and note-taking, empathy for workers in a variety of situations across a variety of different backgrounds is probably something you're thinking about. But explicitly stating that helps align everyone internally as to what your goals and values are. So by explicitly saying, we are aiming to make a usable experience for all different kinds of workers, from the low tech to the high tech, across a variety of locations and devices. This actually tells me a lot as a customer. It tells me you're thinking about Windows and Mac, PCs, iOS and Android. Perhaps you're thinking about the localization of language, and even potentially thinking about all different kinds of Wi-Fi connections. There are also design considerations that could guide your product. How does a senior manager in Germany using a PC differ from a newly hired IT candidate using Mac in Argentina? They both need a streamlined experience. And then this relates to point 2, user research to guide decision-making. So user research to guide decision-making. User research can help guide your design principles along with your design features within your product, service, or software. And I know this sounds really obvious, but you'd be surprised how often people say that they don't have time for user research. But even doing quick interviews with customers, potential customers, or people within a key demographic can help elucidate all kinds of new information. For example, when I moved to Germany a few years ago, I didn't realize how shaky the internet connection was. So remember that previous example I mentioned about that manager in Germany? Well, knowing that that manager has doesn't have a lot of internet bandwidth, especially in the evenings, would really change or affect how you're making software. So knowing that your software has to work across Mac and PC is really important, and that it comes out that can come out of even just the shortest and smallest of user interview sessions. Next slide, please. So this slide is going to cover design patterns, and then the point of design patterns and how clarity is really key in having good design. So what is a design pattern? Design patterns for UX are reusable design components that are used to solve common usability problems that users experience. For instance, a breadcrumb trail that shows users the path from the home page to the page they are on is a design pattern. And design patterns in UX are slightly similar to design patterns for code. Design patterns for code are typically solutions or elements that relate to commonly occurring problems in software design. You can think of them like pre-made blueprints or libraries that you can customize to accommodate a variety of different kinds of interactions. So a code design pattern can be something like how saving can look fairly standardized across different kinds of software, and the process itself technically can be similar. What do we associate with the act of saving? Is it a particular button? Is it an auto function? Is it a placement inside of the hierarchy of a product? Perhaps a navigation bar? Perhaps it's all of the above. Design patterns and being consistent with these patterns is extremely important for user clarity, so they go hand in hand. And this all relates to user understanding. So for example, if you're building a new kind of software, really looking at how other well-known or popular software in that domain is extraordinarily helpful, like how it's designed, because that software is probably using domain-specific UX patterns and coding design patterns to create a cohesive kind of understanding. So design patterns and consistency are often why design looks similar and feels similar, regardless of where the app is made. But then how can we stand out while being usable and accessible? What a great question. This is where understanding color and font and hierarchy and language is key. And this is where you can really stand out and shine. By using consistent design patterns, we can let interesting or bright color choices with a funky font, along with really playful language, really let our software stand out. I'm a big fan of playful language as long as it's not confusing, but having puns or fun and accessible descriptions can be super important in brand identity and brand awareness. I recommend trying to be funny, but also user testing to ensure that your jokes are landing and that your product is still understandable. Next slide. And I know we aren't really supposed to call out any one particular product, but I really love this 404 page, and it's a reference to a very particular Kanye West song. Now, we could think today, would we want to reference a Kanye song? Maybe, depending upon our group. But a few years ago, this was super clever and very cute because it made this 404 page feel a bit more personal and really tied to a specific brand of Spotify, which is music. And also it was getting updated. So it also felt consistent, like someone was caring. It's really nice sometimes to change something like a 404 page to incorporate new jokes, etc. Next slide. Another way to improve design is the power of UX writing. So UX writing is pretty much what it sounds like on the tin. It's writing related to UX and copywriting. Words really matter in terms of digital product design. And it's important to balance technical speak with understanding. Not all words will mean the same thing to your audience. And this is how I approach UX writing. I really try to pretend like I'm writing for a 5-year-old, but let's say a 5-year-old who has a very similar pop cultural references to me and actually may be a genius. But I still need to make sure that the descriptions are simplified and legible. My descriptions need to be short and clear so that someone that I don't know can understand exactly what I'm trying to say. This is a lot like walking a very tight rope. In some cases, you'll have to make a decision. Are you writing for a more knowledgeable audience or a more general audience? Some cases, if you're working with a very, very particular group and it's very well documented in your team that you are servicing just that core group, then I say write to that group's understanding. However, in most cases, we aren't doing that. Even if we think we're writing for one group, our product is actually used by so many groups we're not aware of. This is where writing for a general audience and using plain language really matters. Plain language is clear, straightforward expression, only using as many words as necessary. It's language that avoids obscurity and inflated vocabulary and convoluted sentence structure. It's not baby talk or overly simplified English. I think of it as being as straightforward as possible. For example, if you're making a government website for voting sign up, you're actually making a website for the very general public in a particular area. How you describe voting for the general public is different than how you describe it to a seasoned politician. Or with medical websites, how a doctor would describe medical conditions to another doctor is probably very different than how they describe it to a patient. The goal is to aim for maximum understanding, hence this advocating for plain language. Next slide. And this is where I want to put UX writing into context with an example. I learned about this in real time a few years ago when I was working as a design researcher for an AI company. We had a tool that was analyzing tone and sentences. And after it launched, and for a few months, we noticed the sales team was really struggling with the tool, and so were our potential customers. There's a lot of confusion. We couldn't really figure out how, after all, the tool was super well designed, and we had co-designed with our engineers to really ensure that we were explaining machine learning, that it really rang true to machine learning experts. So I conducted more user testing, and I quickly realized we had written the instructions, the labels, and every piece of text to resonate with machine learning experts, but not our actual audience, which was the general public and salespeople. We hadn't written this to resonate with CEOs and VPs of tech companies who may know a lot about technology, but aren't machine learning experts. For example, we were describing everything as confidence levels. What does confidence sound like to you here in this webinar? People were misinterpreting the tool. They thought that the tool was confidently saying the text was angry or happy, not that it was a probability or a likelihood that the emotion was anger. We then user tested with more plain language descriptions like you see above and changed the word confidence to likelihood and added in probability. And we saw a lot of improvement in terms of people understanding the tool's interface. Next slide. But design can also go wrong. While design can help explain, it can help confuse. So inconsistent design is confusing. It can overwhelm if we have too many features or too many words, and it can not fit your intended audience. So we can think we're making something for our audience and we've actually made something really unhelpful. Design needs to be consistent. It's important to look at the product you're building and what exists in the market, as I've currently mentioned. If you're building something for iOS, Apple publishes a lot of guides on how to design consistently for iOS apps and software. Following those suggestions actually makes your product usable and useful. And then that leads directly into how to balance information without overload. A really big area of concern is balancing enough information, but not too much. Even though we're building in software, it's important to think of the space as constricted. Too much text overwhelms. One thing to consider is how much can you say as legibly and succinctly as possible. So this is where, again, UX writing is really important. And I recommend hiring a UX writer or a copywriter. But if you're looking to hone these skills yourself, I recommend giving yourself a tweet limit, like something under 240 characters, and pick a product and try to write the instructions in 1 to 2 tweets. Then ask someone who doesn't know your product, like a friend, if they understand what you've written. Keep repeating this exercise until it becomes succinct and understandable. And the last thing, not fitting your intended audience. This is where user research is so important. It's important to understand the actual needs of your core audience. Is there a very particular need that they need addressed right now? How does that affect the success of your product? For example, if you're making a video conferencing app and you've noticed your core group is often using it on their phone, perhaps really focusing on mobile issues would be the best area for improvements. Do they need a really quick way to send out invites? That'd be a thing to focus on for mobile versus trying to first launch that for desktop. Next slide. I want to leave you on this last note. This is how I think of design. Design can be an equalizing action that distills code and policy into understandable interfaces. This is the force that I see that design has in the world. I really want you to think about that, especially with the later slides about GDPR or cookie banners or privacy by design or dark patterns. Or for example, let's think about online harassment interstitials and what those look like. Think about data disclosures. Design is really integral into getting these important technical systems and political systems, like the policy of technology, to become understandable to users. Design can uplift and it can obfuscate. So design's role in software is incredibly important. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Caroline. That was great. So I'm going to talk about where design starts to go wrong. And that's this area that we call dark patterns. Next slide, please. So before we go into it, let me review a little bit. I know Caroline just talked about design patterns, but just to reiterate, these are reusable components that we use to solve common design problems. So the example on this page is the toggle switch that you often see in mobile interfaces. And so these are not necessarily things that are developed by academics per se. They often come about or evolve through repeated testing and usage, and the design community tends to kind of coalesce around particular designs and then reshare them throughout. And so the pattern part of a design pattern, is the idea of these kind of reusable components that are consistent that help solve problems. Next slide. But a dark pattern or a manipulative design is something that basically either intentionally or unintentionally takes advantage of those consistent uses of patterns to manipulate or coerce people in a way that they're not necessarily expecting or intending. So I'm going to go through a couple of quick definitions of dark patterns because there's still, I think, a bit of kind of variability in how people describe them. And so Harry Brignall, who runs the website Deceptive Design, he first identified these in the wild over a decade ago. And he calls them a user interface that has been carefully crafted to trick users into doing things. So they're not mistakes, they're carefully crafted with a solid understanding of human psychology, and they don't have the user's best interests in mind. And another definition from the research community is techniques used to manipulate users to do things that they would not otherwise do. Next slide. Ultimately, when we talk about dark patterns, I focus on the outcome and not the intent, just because it can be really hard to kind of prove intent. And you can actually, it's possible that through sloppy design, not testing, you can do these things unintentionally. But ultimately, I tend to focus on this definition because it pulls out a couple of these underlying principles that I think are really important that I'll discuss a little bit more, which is that they're user interface design choices that benefit an online service by coercing, manipulating, or deceiving users into making unintended and potentially harmful decisions. And as you've been noticing as we go through these, I'll have examples that I'll talk through. So next slide, please. Okay, so where are we finding these today? Predominantly, we're seeing them in the e-commerce and online shopping context. And in that context, what we typically see is that people lose money from those interactions, or they pay more than they were attending, whether it's through price discrimination, added fees, or just the pressure to make a purchase that maybe they wouldn't have otherwise made. Next is the disclosure and consent context. And that's where we see people essentially over disclosing information, consenting to things they may have not otherwise chose to consent to. And so we tend to look at those in terms of privacy, which I'll talk about more in a bit. The other area is gaming and gambling. And so these are often attention-based dark patterns or manipulative designs. It's not only in gaming and gambling, but I think those are good examples of the types of apps or software programs where we see those employed. But the goal there is to really keep you engaged, waste your time, and keep you coming back for more. And so the key thing I want to say, though, is that we usually are finding deceptive and manipulative designs at decision points. So places where people are having to make a choice. And that's where they're most likely to make one that doesn't benefit them directly because the UI has, hidden those choices or made them harder to understand, or taken advantage of the fact that we often will just click through things and make it the easiest to click through a default that doesn't necessarily represent the user's best interest. Next, please. Okay, so how do these things work? So as Harry Brignall's definition alluded to, they're based predominantly on psychology. And there's two kind of pieces of the puzzle that they particularly build off of. One are heuristics. Heuristics are mental shortcuts that we make in order to kind of make decisions under pressure or make decisions more efficiently. And so a couple examples of that would be the availability heuristic, which is when we make predictions based on the easiest example that first comes to mind, or the anchoring heuristic, where when you're making a choice, you often rely on the very first piece of information you may have reviewed, and that's just the easiest thing on which for you to base a decision without doing kind of additional critical thinking. Cognitive biases are another way that dark patterns, or that's one of the features that dark patterns take advantage of. So these are what we call systematic errors in thinking. And these are things that we think that humans in general all suffer from. Again, just based on kind of the way that we think through and make decisions under pressure. And so the confirmation bias is an example of that, where you're seeking out answers that support your own beliefs rather than kind of considering things more critically. Or hindsight bias, where after something happens, you think it was far more predictable and far more likely to happen when you're looking retrospectively than you could if you're thinking forward. Next slide, please. So let me talk a bit about the different types of dark patterns and kind of what they're actually accomplishing. So there's really kind of two major groups. There are those that modify the decision space, and those are often things we think about in terms of the choice architecture, meaning the choices that we present to people and what kind of decisions they're able to make within a particular interface or at a particular decision point. And so within that world, we have things that are asymmetric. So choices that essentially benefit one choice over the other. And this is probably one of the most common things that many of us encounter, in that you may go through a consent dialogue, for example, and it will have the continue or I accept button highlighted in a bright color, whereas the decline or cancel button might be grayed out or just made to look less prominent. Covert design decisions, these are interface choices where you get essentially steered towards something without really explicitly understanding that you're being kind of put there. So this might be, a default in a product that is set to, sharing your information rather than not. In order for you to even know it's there, you might have to actually go out and search for it. It's not being put up in front and center for you to engage with. Restrictive, these are interface choices that really limit the number of options that you have artificially, potentially. So cookie consents, which we'll go into more. For example, if you give a cookie consent that just has an accept button and no cancel, no reject, that would be a very restrictive interface. And these are all kind of changing the options that someone has available to them to make decisions. The other category are things that manipulate the information flow. So things that subvert or impair the types of information that you're able to get. So interfaces that hide information, so they don't give you the full number of choices, or again, if you need to seek something out to understand how it works, you have to do that work on your own. The interface isn't presenting it to you. Or things that are outright deceptive. So That's certainly a category of dark patterns. That's more clearly in the realm of what policymakers will absolutely intervene on. You know, when you are actually not telling the truth in your interface or presenting someone a false choice, those situations are outright deceptive. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go quickly through a few examples before I hand it off to Luke. So this is from the e-commerce context. This is false urgency. So this is when, and many of you have probably experienced this firsthand, you're on a website and it's trying to encourage you to make a quick and fast decision because they're trying to tell you either you have limited amount of time or there's only 3 of these left. In many cases, when researchers have probed beyond the interface, they've found that these claims are often just false. And so if you are to use a type of social proof, such as 3 other people are looking at this right now, or, you know, we really actually do have 5 widgets left. Like, you really need to make sure that it's truthful, because otherwise these become flat out deceptive. Next slide, please. Another area of concern are what we call guilt or confirm shaming. And so these are instances where you're giving the user a choice, but you're trying to steer them towards the choice that you want, and you're trying to make them guilty or feel shameful for trying to execute their own choice or their own consent. And so again, this is something that many of us see often when we're unsubscribing to something where the service is saying, please don't go, you know, you're a terrible person if you click it, you know, if you leave. So things like that, policymakers are becoming increasingly concerned because they lean towards being extremely unfair. And they do, I find even personally, I have to stop and, you know, think about them before I make those choices, because they deliberately pull at your heartstrings. Next slide. Nagging, and go ahead and click through this. So next, yeah, thanks. So nagging is just the use of kind of constant reminders to try to get you to do something that, again, you may not be inclined to do, but the service is just like, come on, we really want you to do this. And they'll just keep chipping away and nagging you in order to get you to comply. Next slide. Obstruction. So this is also one that's become much more on the radar of policymakers. And I think the best example is, you know, you may sign up for a service. It may be fairly simple, may take just 2 or 3 steps to sign up or create an account or whatever it might be. Then you have a disproportionate number of steps to cancel, including potentially being forced to call in, where you may be subject to an upsell or some other type of pressure to not cancel your subscription. And so one of the things that we're seeing in the EU, for example, in recent legislation, is a call to actually make these things proportionate, meaning a company can no longer throw a bunch of extra steps because they just don't want you to cancel. It needs to be proportionate to what the work it took you to sign up. Next. Okay, and then finally, coercive consent. I'll talk a little bit more about this. I believe Luke will as well. But in these different types of online consent contexts, again, the question of whether you're being given a full set of choices, or if the choices are presented to you in a way that assumes you'll just simply kind of pick the one that the company wants you to pick. There are many different examples of this. And again, I'll walk through a couple and when I come back on in a minute. Next slide. Okay, and then finally, just on this too, we're seeing these types of patterns in particular show up in relation to the California Consumer Privacy Act, which gave consumers a do not sell right. And so I'm going to actually decompose one of these examples when I come back to really highlight the extent to which people are being given very unclear choices that don't map well to their privacy expectations. Next. And I'll hand it off to Luke. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jen. You know, we're talking about all of these design choices and conscious decisions that we have to be making. But as a designer, I sometimes feel like it's tough to put myself in that proper mindset of solving a problem if I don't fully understand why we're even chasing after something in the first place. So before I dive into this idea of designing experiences with an intent purpose of leveraging the cookie banner to build an innovative and impactful first impression, I want to talk a little bit about why we care about cookies and privacy in the first place. And oddly enough, there are roots going all the way back to 1905 with an expose piece by Upton Sinclair called The Jungle. Next slide, please, Dave. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here, but it's important to understand there's this long history of American corporate risk and liability and the catch-up act that has to occur in order for legislation to match innovation and design. But a brief history is, in the jungle, Sinclair goes to great lengths to call out the abhorrent state of food manufacturing in the US during the turn of the 20th century, and the dangers to the individuals, both employees and consumers, that are being posed in these conditions. Life-altering, physically threatening things like sickness and death that's going unchecked as more and more aspects of life became streamlined and industrialized. It was a black box to consumers a lot of the times, unsure of what's actually happening and how things are being made. Back in those early days, there wasn't the stringent legislation and careful surveillance of government agencies like the FDA might provide now. In fact, the FDA was started a year after this piece was published, and through this work, Sinclair began a huge boom of societal concern about a lack of corporate accountability with the aim to protect the consumer. It all sounds fairly familiar, actually. Next slide, please, Dave. If we think back to the Cambridge Analytica and Facebook hearings, it's this exposure of what's really going on with people's data and what's actually happening behind the veil of innovation and large corporate expansions into a new, previously uncharted online domain. Next slide, please, Dave. And while it's not as viscerally appalling as rats or fingers in your food, it's equally as important to understanding this spark of widespread privacy changes in both the public opinion and the legislation. And it's our job as designers and privacy experts to start now building trust about data and privacy between the consumers and the organizations in the US. But again, it's tough. It's a catch-up act. Years after we've started collecting data and designing services and platforms for a new era, a digital and data-based modernity, we're now finally seeing more and more states, countries, and individuals implement more privacy changes, privacy legislation, with the tide of more privacy tools and power for users and the turning of a new page because of it. Next slide, please, Dave. So let's briefly talk about the cookie ban. It's just a small piece of information stored in your browser, as seemingly insignificant as the chocolate chip kind, but is actually a focused aspect of this massive regulatory revolution about protecting individuals' rights online. And while you can see it as, you can see the need to include cookie banners as a hindrance to the digital journey, we can also see it as the start of a new entry path to website user experience design. And with that in mind, we're starting to see a rollback of sorts, reducing the current state of increased hands and eyeballs on data, a push for better design, safer experiences, and more transparency in corporations while providing greater levels of protection for our consumers. And with those intentions, to build more human-centric, privacy-focused standards in our websites and platforms, one of the most important aspects is building that trust with a careful consideration for housing and protecting an individual's personal data and upholding their rights without being a detriment to the experience of browsing the web. Next slide, please, Dave. We've most likely all been there at one point or another. You open up a web page trying to find a video or see some information about a product or service when we're met with an interruption, an intrusion to our browser and our private lives. It's a pop-up that has some odd colors with strange words, and I can't even choose the option to say no before I even get to the page. What does this have to do with the site? This feeling of unease and discomfort, and even sometimes annoyance for the oddity that is a poorly designed cookie banner, is really what we need to avoid. And when we think about these things, we can't just cover off on some checklist for compliance sake and then send it out into the world thinking there'll be no repercussions for how it can affect and impact a visit from a consumer's perspective. Next slide, please, Dave. Because even before a page loads, there's a certain level of familiarity and a predetermined expectation that comes from visiting a brand or company's website. For instance, if I'm checking out a website for an internationally recognized professional services firm, I expect some level of cleanliness in the design, a high amount of professionalism in the way it presents itself. But if I'm seeing really sloppy language with bad placement over top of core features and a mismatched color on the banners, well, it subverts my expectations and feelings for the firm itself, not just that single site visit. It's the small things that add up to become entirely changed experiences on the user's end. So what can we do as designers, privacy experts, and leaders in our organizations? Well, we need to be focusing on capturing a perception and an identity inside of that cookie banner as well. So when a visitor is greeted with a pop-up, they're welcomed into an experience and a journey that begins with an open and transparent exchange of trust and consent. And here's where we see a large amount of opportunity for improvement when designing banners. matching that feel and the expectations of our brands and companies at every step of the journey. And it's all kicked off by that first click and the pop-up of a banner. Next slide, please, Dave. It's fairly easy to see when it's side by side like this. Even if you're not a fan of the mustard yellow, the cohesion of color and the clear purpose behind the decision itself makes for an experience that feels like it's thought out the entire way through. Next slide, please. You're presenting yourself as a brand that protects and cares for its consumers, thinking about privacy at each step and every junction. Next slide, please. If we take a look beyond the design itself, looking at the path that a visitor takes starting from the cookie banner. While it's not a distinct metric, the 3-click rule still has a lesson to teach us. It's an important feeling and guideline to consider, essentially boiling down to, if the user is going to your site, there's a purpose behind that click. They should get the information they came for in as few clicks as possible. We should be taking a look at our banners and really analyzing them for the dark patterns as Jen just talked about. Things like confusing or contradicting language, hidden data processing that isn't told to users, or an overall lack of perceived choice from a consumer's perspective. Next slide, please. If we think back to why we're doing this in the first place, it's to build this trust between the business and the person, the human, the individual on the other end of that browser, to forward the idea that privacy isn't just this afterthought in our organizations, but rather a key and fundamental piece of our identity that we build into each initiative and every one of our offerings. And looking out into the current landscape of privacy and online data, we start to see rifts forming between those that are embracing this transition and those that are opposing it. Legislation and public opinion is coming into this ideology that the consumer deserves data protection, and there must be some sort of accountability for the power that collecting and processing data holds. We're designing and building for a future internet that is more beautiful, transparent, and privacy-focused than ever before. And while it won't make you physically ill like some bad pork shoulder from the 1900s, a data leak or a privacy breach can leave your users feeling angry and lose trust with your organization entirely. People are weary of what's going on now. Now that there's been the exposure to behind the scenes, a peek into Pandora's database. Next slide, please, Dave. So we need to be putting our best foot forward and presenting ourselves as a company that cares about the individual with proper, thoughtful, privacy-centric design. Privacy cannot be an afterthought in your organizations. Nowadays, it's about way more than just not getting fined. There's an opportunity for many individuals to take back the power over their data and their personal information. And your business doesn't want to be left behind as privacy controls, protections make their way more and more into our daily lives, our organizations, and also our laws. Thanks.
Thanks, and I'll close us up, tying together a few of the issues that both Luke and Caroline raised in their presentations. Next, please. So as Luke was just saying, privacy cannot be an afterthought. And increasingly, that's not just a kind of a principle, but also a potential compliance or legal obligation. The best example I can give you is this framework that's been developed by Dr. Anne Cavoukian, who is a former privacy commissioner in Canada, which she is termed privacy by design. And we actually are seeing privacy by design written into, I think it's actually written into the GDPR, as well as here in the US, the FTC has definitely kind of embraced it as a potential, or as a principle that they expect companies to adhere to. And so I won't go through all of the different principles. You can go ahead and look that up on your own. But just to say that increasingly companies are being held to this idea that at the bare minimum, that you've thought about your customers' privacy from day one. And it no longer can be just an afterthought that you bolt on at the end of the product development process. It really needs to be a consideration, as you design, and not just an afterthought. Next, please. And so just to say that this isn't just a compliance issue. This isn't just a check the box and like, okay, here's the list of things I'm going to do, and that's like, I'm done. What I would suggest is that from a design perspective, and not just from the visual design perspective, but the technical design, the entire design process, you need to have a kind of fundamental understanding of what privacy means to your customers. So there's a couple things I want to unpack there. What do we mean by privacy? That's a little bit of the challenge. I would say it's both kind of incumbent on you and your company to do the work to try to understand what your own users think about privacy. But just to give a couple of pointers about what we mean by talking about privacy more generally, this is not really secrecy. This is a more nuanced understanding of what people expect with their information in different contexts. And so I have a couple of quick pointers in here. Helen Nissenbaum's work, she has an actual book, Privacy in Context. I find that very accessible. It's not very long. I really recommend that for those of you who are trying to think about these issues, pick it up and give it a read. A much longer one, but still, I think it gives a very good overview of a lot of the concerns today, is Shoshana Zuboff's The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And that book actually gave rise to that term. You may have heard this more popularly, this idea of surveillance capitalism. It came from Shoshana's work. It is a very dense book, but it is also, I think, a good reference point for people trying to understand what are the concerns in this space. But ultimately, I won't go into kind of the deep dive of how I would recommend kind of doing the UX or the user research work to understand kind of what privacy means for your customers. But I do emphasize that is something that your designers really do need to come to the table with. Next slide. And I'm just going to go through one last few examples to talk about what I mean here. So earlier I showed a quick slide of these CCPA opt-outs. So these are mandated. The design isn't mandated, but these are mandated by the California Consumer Privacy Act. Some of you may have had to actually implement some of these. Now, I don't know why, honestly, the focus on the way these have been implemented have focused on using a toggle switch. But predominantly when you encounter these, they are often toggle switches. Sometimes they're radio buttons, but often they're using the toggle, which is a type of interaction we mostly see in the mobile context. And the examples on this page are bad examples, to be clear. These are really ambiguous. And the top one, this is basically, it's not clear to you what you're turning on or off. And the same with the other one on the lower part of the screen, that you're being asked, do you want to continue sharing under California law? But your option is to agree or disagree, which is a real big mismatch between kind of the question that's being asked. Next slide. So this is something I just want to unpack a little bit more to describe what I mean. So I think one of the fundamental problems here is that companies are really afraid to ask this question to consumers. Do you want to share your personal information? Do you want to sell? And they're not asking it in more of a yes/no context. It's being presented as this kind of legal right that you either agree or disagree to. And so the first example on this page is a screenshot from an actually a mobile app, where you're told if you're a California resident, you can opt out of the sale of your personal information. And then you're shown that text, do not sell my personal information. And again, a toggle. Well, what state are you in if it's green versus not selected? It's not really clear. You would really have to try to stop and think about it. And some people just may not be able to figure it out. I assume that do not sell, if you're opting in, the toggle switch is green, but I am assuming, I'm not actually even 100% sure. So the example that I did on this page is just to highlight, if I try to deconstruct that a little bit more, here is the right, what you're trying to do is actually ask people, can we sell your personal information? May we sell your personal information? And so one way I would resolve the type of UI I see here, and to be clear, I'm not a designer, this is just a little bit of experimentation, is to actually kind of give somebody a concrete answer. Yes, you may do it. I'm going to have that switch on. Or no, you may not sell it. I'm turning that off. Next slide. But I would even urge like a more concrete way of dealing with this is to not necessarily even put it in terms of, again, these toggles, which again, I'm not sure like why the world has kind of coalesced on the toggles. And that might be something we discuss in our Q&A section. But again, making these choices a much clearer, simpler way for people to truly say, okay, yes, I am agreeing to this, or no, I am not. So in this example, I took the previous UI and I put it into a radio button form, which I hope you would agree, if you look at this, is much clearer than the previous one in terms of trying to communicate a preference rather than trying to agree to this kind of abstract legal principle. So with that, I think we're at time. So I will stop and I believe we'll go into questions, unless Dave, we have another piece we need to do before then.
No, that's great. Thanks so much, Jen, and thank you, Luke and Caroline, for those excellent pieces, those excellent presentations. And to all of you out in the audience that are listening in, we do have some time left for Q&A. So now is a great time to post your questions in either the question and answer panel or the chat, and we will tackle those as we can in the allotted time left. So I want to start by saying really terrific kind of, I think, overview on how those of us that are involved in privacy compliance can work hard with our both what we put out there in terms of verbiage and language, and also design, graphic design and aesthetics to help our users understand their choices clearly. And so I wanted to start by going back to you, Caroline. One thing that strikes me that I'm sure is a common challenge or problem is in working with teams of attorneys, when legal language, as we all know, can be quite dense and long and very wordy, and sometimes language that isn't in quote unquote plain English. So I'm wondering about the challenge of working with legal teams and trying to put out their language that both covers off on legal compliance, but is also understandable and accessible to the public. What's been your experience in terms of working with teams like that and marketing teams and trying to find that balance between getting all the information out there that you need to and having it being concise enough and understandable so that the public can actually comprehend it?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. It's a really great one. And my answer may seem really obvious at first, but it's something I want to highlight that not a lot of teams do this at all or with any consistency, but I found cross collaboration with a marketing team, a design team, and the legal team is often the best way to go. This is something that I've advocated for even with clients that are really big tech companies and platforms. And it's actually worked really well when we've run design sprints and invited the legal team to participate. We've had, trained lawyers teaching them how to wireframe and think of like products and specific language to use. And I know that this sounds really obvious, but I think that that's probably one of the best ways. Otherwise, you kind of end up in this really back and forth of, well, we spent all these hours doing this thing, we sent it to legal, and legal is now offering this feedback, we have to remock it up, and you kind of end up in this endless sort of loop. And one of the best ways to close that loop is to try to directly collaborate across teams and really bring everyone together.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, Caroline. And sometimes the things that seem obvious are maybe easy to say but harder to put into practice. And Luke, it makes me think back to your comments during your section of the presentation about privacy by design and privacy not being an afterthought. And so it really is trying to get in early in the process, the design process, with working with the marketing team, working with customer service team, working with the legal team. And I certainly know that in our client work, we certainly try to do that with one-on-one conversations, a little bit of education. Has that been your experience, Luke, in terms of working with some of our clients and on projects?
Yeah, absolutely. It is really about kind of bridging that gap between the legal side and the design side to make sure that we are checking off on the compliance needs, but also making a product that works for the user and works for the business.
Yeah. Terrific. And then on that, let me kind of go over to you now, Jen, and back to this issue of dark patterns. And to kind of address the 800-pound elephant in the room, why does this happen? why do people use these dark patterns? It's because they're effective. So can you talk a little bit about what you've seen in the past in terms of trying to get people to become aware of how these may be pernicious or not a good long-term strategy, even though it seems like there are short-term gains and short-term benefits to be had there?
Right. So it's an issue I've been tracking actually for over a decade. And originally, you were really only seeing them used by companies where the business model depended on it, where it was mostly outright fraud or deception. Mm-hmm. In the past 5 years, that's changed. They become more ubiquitous. I'm not sure we can pinpoint kind of who pushed them over the barrier of acceptability. But I think companies employ them, I think, because they're effective, and it can be the difference between a 10% conversion rate and a 35% conversion rate, or whatever it might be. The second is that I believe in certain industries they have taken hold, and they kind of just take off like a wildfire. in the sense that I think it can become really easy for one company to do it and their competitors look around and go, oh, well, why don't we do that? They're doing it, like it's okay. And it kind of brings down, I guess I would argue, the ethical bar. And so I've seen entire business segments, like I'd point the finger at the travel industry, honestly, where I think it's become very hard to find a travel website that doesn't engage in some form of these. And it's, as usual, regulators have been slower to catch up, and they're finally, I think that tide is turning. But I think one of the harder issues, again, is that for a lot of companies, it's not that their business model depends on them, but it, kind of gives you a bump. It's almost like a performance enhancing drug, if you want to think about it that way. And so I think, similar to, competitive sports, we've outlawed performance enhancing drugs. And so, similarly, the efforts are on to try to intervene in the dark pattern space. In particular, though, I think the challenge is where the dark pattern, again, it's not central to the business model, but it gives you a little bump. And those are what I call, sometimes they're gray patterns. They're not maybe outright deceptive or outright fraudulent, but it can be kind of like, what's going on here? It's not like, sometimes it's not even abundantly clear to someone the first time they look at something, but a lot of the examples I gave you today were obviously quite clear, or I would argue they're clear. And so, we're just in this stage right now where they've become more ubiquitous, but we're also seeing the pushback, not just from regulators, but again, from customers. I mean, some of the studies that have been done have shown just how angry and frustrated people get when they encounter these. And so again, I think Luke maybe mentioned this earlier too, it's just a very short-term strategy, but ultimately you're making people angry and you're making them more distrustful. And so that's certainly one of the reasons to not cross that path. And
right. So just to summarize, and what you made me just think, Jen, is it's interesting interacting from the consumer side or the company side with products or services to sell, and the customer side on the other side. We're separated by a screen, so there isn't a direct feedback. So as you say, short-term strategy. Customers are feeling aggravated, frustrated. Maybe they make these decisions that they're kind of led to and then regret them later, which creates that kind of post-angst there. And just to be clear, as we stated earlier, but increasingly, the use of these manipulative techniques are illegal, as called out by particular laws, and increasingly particular laws. And then we've already talked about kind of the whole ethical implications here in terms of what it's doing to break down that level of consumer trust, which companies work so hard to build up. So I'm kind of wondering, and really, I'm going to guess the answer is there's not much available, but it just made me think, both for you, Jen and Caroline, working in the space, are there any efforts underway in terms of organizations or standards or best practices for privacy compliance design that we might point to? I know, Jen, you referenced earlier Ann Cavoukian's work, which has been around for some time, privacy by design principles, but I'm wondering if there are any evolving or emerging kind of collaborations or groups where folks could go if they're looking for kind of examples of good design. And perhaps there aren't, because it's very early. This transition is just taking place, so maybe it's a little bit early for that.
Sure. I mean, I'd be remiss to not mention the ICO, where I am a part-time fellow, so the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK. They're putting out a lot of really outstanding research on things related to privacy by design, design guidelines related to regulation, for example, like GDPR, how to sort of interpret or think about transparency in design. I think, or I believe, like 18F and the USDS have probably published similar things. At least the New Zealand government has published privacy by design guidelines, so that is also worth checking out. A friend of mine, Natalie Cadronell, and I, we've worked on a human rights-centered design series of guidelines, which is really focusing on privacy and security. I'll pop that in the chat, Dave, if you'd like to share that. But there are a lot of really great guidelines out there.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Caroline. And I'm remembering that when the GDPR first came out, the ICO was an absolute leader in terms of regulators around the world and producing excellent educational materials. Continuing to lead it in that space. So thanks for that. And we just got a question here in the chat that I want to address. It's excellent. We've got a couple here. So here's a question for, let's see, who might this be best for? After companies have implemented these principles and consent flows, what metrics should they look at to measure whether these initiatives are successful? How do you prove ROI to senior stakeholders? That's a really great question. Would anybody like to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I can go ahead with that, Dave. The big metric you should always be looking at is your opt-in versus your opt-out rate. That's going to really tell you what your consumers are feeling or thinking when they look at a banner. And then, as Caroline and Jen have talked about too, you need to be doing some user testing, whether or not that's showing it to your mom and making sure that she can understand what the cookie banner is saying, or actually going out and doing a full series of testing. There needs to be some sort of proof, as you're saying, to show to seniors. And that big rate is opt-in versus opt-out. Additionally, though, and not to be the history guy of this chat, but we did see something similar in cybersecurity a while ago when it was first coming onto the scene, where it was trying to prove to your senior stakeholders how important it is to start getting these tools to protect your business. And the big thing is to kind of look out into the current landscape and see what's going on. And you can point to any number of people or companies or legislation now that is kind of forcing the hand. So that's also a big aspect of it. It's not only just making sure that your banners are getting good opt-in versus opt-out, but also making sure that you're protecting yourself from a legal and a compliance side. And that's going to help kind of push that with senior leadership as well. If you can get legal on your side to say, hey, this is something really important to our business. This is something very important to the way that we want to present ourselves to our consumers going forward.
Terrific. Thanks, Luke. Another question in the chat, and this is probably just about all we have time for here, but Caroline, this seems like it would be in your wheelhouse. Automated detection of dark patterns is an issue now enabling tools, but machine learning detectability still suffers from the specific features of each dark pattern, also the future DPs. Which tips would you give to build these tools? Take a stab at that.
Jen may actually have slightly more of a background in that than I would, primarily because at the ICO, we're still establishing how we'll be investigating dark patterns. We look to our colleagues at the CMA over in the UK, where they do a lot of specific investigation as a team. So not necessarily looking at automated detection, but rather doing a lot of like qualitative and quantitative kinds of measurements along with market analysis. So it's sort of hard for me to say how to improve it, but I would say you always need a human in the loop in these things. And that at least on the ICO side, I imagine that we'll be probably responding to things that are reported versus automatic detection, but that could also change in the future.
Jen, did you want to?
Sure. Hi, Christiana. Those are both the questions you ask are tough, quite honestly, and they're good. And I don't have an easy answer for both the ones that you asked in the chat. I mean, I think you're right about machine learning. This is an area that I'm very specifically focusing on in my own work. I don't know how we'll automate detection. And I think what your question implies there is that hyper-personalized experience that people may have. And so I don't know if it's so much about automated detection as much as trying to think about the inputs that enable these things. And so I'm not sure they're detectable, outside of, not in the way that we've been thinking about it traditionally. They're not going to be, if they're hyper personalized, for example, they're obviously not going to be crawlable in that sense. So, I think it's probably a question of what do we do to limit the inputs that allow them. But, I think TBD, I don't know how much self-reporting would help us. And then, I think similarly, your second question on metrics, again, I think it depends on how we isolate the harms. And so I think that's a necessary part of the conversation to realize that dark patterns or manipulative designs don't have a single form of harm. There are multiple. There's the economic harms, and those are probably the easiest that we can measure and quantify. But attention, time wasting, for example, addiction, like those are different harms. And I think the way we measure them will be dependent on how we try to calculate or quantify them. And we don't have enough time for me to kind of expound on that, but just to say that I think we just need to recognize, at least up front, that there isn't a single way that we're all harmed from these things. There's very kind of different silos, and some of them may be outside the consumer protection context, just to kind of put a pin in that.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, well, thanks so much, Jen and Caroline and Luke. We are just have a couple minutes left, so I want to wrap up with some closing remarks here. So again, thanks for all the efforts to put this information together and get it out there for folks. As a reminder to those of you in the audience, we are recording this program, so we're going to be sending a follow-up email to those that have registered for it, the webinar. And in that email, we'll have a link so you can view the recording, and also a link so that you can access a PDF of the slide materials. So don't worry, we'll be sending that out following the program here. And as you can see on the slide in front of you here, all of us have made our contact information available. So you can feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any further questions. And then lastly, just wanted to make a mention of our firm where Luke and I work, the Level Up Consulting Partners. If any of you are interested in our products or services, you can reach out to me directly. And thanks to Level Up for sponsoring the program today. So with that, great big thank you to everybody and for participating in the panel today, for those of you out in the audience for joining us. And I'll take us to a program close and wish everybody a terrific rest of the day. Thanks everybody for joining us.